Here we go.
Yesterday, Senate Republicans put forward the HEALS Act, our framework for another round of historic relief for American workers and families. Our nation stands at a challenging crossroads. We have 1 foot in this pandemic and 1 foot in the recovery. We can't go back to April, and until we have a vaccine, we can't go back to normal either. What the American people need is smart, safe, and sustainable middle ground, and they need Congress' help to construct it. That's exactly what our major proposal would do. Now, everyone knows that another rescue package will need to be bipartisan to pass the Senate. So the question before the country is now really quite simple. If we're going to see the versions of House and Senate Democrats that helped us unanimously pass the CARES Act back in March, or are we instead going to see the same Democrats who decided to block police reform in June and lash out at Senator Tim Scott's proposal instead of working with him to make law? In other words, Madam President, do the Speaker of the House and the Democratic leader believe that struggling Americans deserve an outcome, or do they want to stay on the sidelines and recite talking points? Well, yesterday, even before the Democrats had seen our legislation, they began attacking it. All the tired old partisan tropes were trotted out. For releasing a proposal that wants to give schools even more reopening money than House Democrats' bill, and which would continue additional federal unemployment benefits at 8 times the dollar amount that Democrats established during the last crisis. We were informed here on the floor that, quote, those Republican hard-right money people don't want the federal government to help anybody. It's beyond parody. Republicans put forward a $1 trillion proposal for kids, jobs, and health care, including direct cash to households, and even more cash to unemployment people. And the Democrats say it proves we don't want to help people. They say it proves we don't want to help people. These are not serious statements. It's politics as usual, with talking points that went stale 20 years ago. But the week is young, and the HEALS Act is full of provisions that I would frankly dare my Democratic colleagues to actually say they oppose. Republicans want to extend supplemental unemployment insurance at hundreds of dollars per week. If Democrats block legislation, it will stop altogether. Republicans want to send thousands of dollars more to American families through direct payments. If Democrats won't come to the table, they get nothing. Republicans want to use tax incentives to encourage the rehiring of laid-off workers and the creation of safer workplaces through things like testing, remodeling, and PPE. If Democrats block action, workers will be on their own. Republicans want to specifically protect Medicare seniors from a spike in premiums because of COVID-19. If Democrats treat the HEALS Act like they treated police reform, seniors will be on their own as well. Republicans want to pour money into K through 12 schools and give greater flexibility to child care providers so that Americans' kids can have a safe and more normal school year. If Democrats block action, school districts will get none of it. Republicans want to create a second targeted round of PPE to keep Main Street small businesses above water. If Democrats won't negotiate, the now open signs will come down and going out of business signs will replace them. Republicans want to proactively expand our domestic manufacturing capability for masks and PPE and medical countermeasures. If Democrats refuse to negotiate, we'll be just as dependent on adversaries as competitors in the next crisis. Republicans want to protect doctors, nurses, school districts, and universities from a second epidemic of frivolous lawsuits. If Democrats don't come to the table, our nation's reopening will be at the mercy of trial lawyers. Republicans want to go even further to backstop hospitals and healthcare providers and fuel the sprint for vaccines. If Democrats won't let us, Americans will just have to cross our fingers and hope the medical system remains stable. So to be clear, Madam President, Republicans are not proposing to cut any relief. Under current law, expanded UI expires and is replaced with nothing. Under current law, there are no more direct payments and no second PPP. Every single thing we put forward is a way to get more relief into people's hands. Our Democratic colleagues want to pretend it's a controversy. It is controversial somehow that taxpayers should not pay people more not to work than the people who do go back to work. They want to pretend it's controversial that taxpayers should not pay people more not to work than people who do go back to work. American people don't call it a controversy. They call it common sense. They call it basic fairness. This is absolutely a time to be generous and provide additional federal relief to people who've been laid off, but we should not be redistributing money away from the essential workers who have remained at their posts. We should not be taxing somebody who's been stocking shelves for months so the government can pay her neighbor more than she makes to sit at home. That's what we're talking about. Taxing essential workers to pay their neighbors a bonus to stay home. One study by university economists just found that these benefits can exceed people's previous incomes 2/3 of the time. 2/3 of the time. They found the median recipient earns 134% of their prior salary. That means half are making even more than that. That's just not fair. It's not compatible with a reopening economy, and more than 6 in 10 Americans feel this creates a disincentive to work. Even the Democratic House Majority Leader said just this morning that our prospective vote has some validity to it, and we ought to deal with that. It's not $600 or bust. That was the Majority Leader in the House. The Democratic Majority Leader over in the House, quote, "It's not $600 or bust, so let's get past this partisan cheap shots and have an adult conversation." Look at it this way. Think about one street, one block, in one neighborhood, anywhere in America. Think how they would benefit if this bill were signed into law. Right now, several families on that block probably have no idea whether their kids will be headed back to school in a few weeks. Our bill would provide the money and legal certainty for school districts to reopen safely. Now let's talk about the family's pocketbooks. Likely every mailbox on that street or each checking account would get another $1,200 per adult and $500 per dependent. For a family of 4, we're talking about $3,400 in cash. Maybe some of these homeowners are among the millions of Americans who've been thrown into joblessness. As we've discussed, they'd get hundreds of dollars more every week in added unemployment. But because we're doing it smarter, if anyone on the street owns a coffee shop or a contracting business, they won't hear from workers that they are earning more by staying at home. And those unemployed workers will get back on the job faster when our bill supercharges incentives for rehiring and helps pay for health and safety in the workplace. Maybe some other people on this street have held on to their jobs because of the historic Paycheck Protection Program. But their employer is considering closing down, with that relief nearly exhausted. Our targeted second round of PPP could keep their paycheck coming instead of a pink slip. Maybe a retired couple lives on this block. If our proposal for Medicare Part B premiums becomes law, they'll be protected from a spike in cost during the pandemic. And needless to say, every single person on that street would benefit from even stronger federal investments in the diagnostics, treatments, and vaccines that will ultimately win this healthcare battle for all of us. So look, Madam President, it's very simple. Partisan histrionics will not get any American family any of the relief I just described. Calling names will not get school districts one dime. Washington finger pointing will not add 1 cent to anyone's unemployment check. Democrats face a simple choice. They can come to the table, work with Republicans, and engage seriously to make law for the American people, or they can stay on the sidelines, point fingers, and let another rescue package go the same way as the police reform bill they killed back in June. The Republicans are ready to govern. We just need Democrats to decide whether they're serious about actually making a law.
Section.
Now, Madam President, yesterday, after putting the Senate on pause for 3 months and after months of blocking nearly every Democratic attempt to pass legislation related to coronavirus, Senate Republicans finally revealed their long overdue proposal for the next phase of COVID relief. In my many years in serving in this chamber, I have never seen a Republican majority, a Senate majority of any type, respond to a national emergency in such a disorganized and disoriented fashion. Weeks of infighting among Senate Republicans in the White House caused unnecessary and harmful delays. Instead of presenting a single unified bill, Republicans released several separate drafts last night, and there might be more today. They can't agree on one bill. They can't get 51 votes for anything that's comprehensive, that deals with the problems, the very real problems the American people face. And even before Republicans announced their bills, senior Republican senators admitted that they lacked full support of Republicans. 2 Republican chairmen have said that probably half of the Republican Senate will vote against their own proposals. Worst of all, the Republican plan falls dreadfully short. It is ununified, unserious, completely unsatisfactory. My Republican friends, this is the greatest crisis America has faced in generations. 100 years since the last health crisis of this magnitude, 75 years since the Great Depression. And you are paying attention to your corporate friends and not answering the needs of the people. We Democrats want a real bill that answers people's needs, that deals with the serious problems we face. That's what we're fighting for. We'll keep fighting for it. And our Republican friends are nowhere to be found. While the Republican proposal fails to provide crucial relief for families, workers, and the unemployed, it is littered with corporate giveaways, K Street handouts, and presidential pet projects. The Republican bill includes a $20 billion slush fund for large agribusiness and tax breaks for 3 martini lunches, but it doesn't provide a dime in food assistance for hungry kids. It includes an unprecedented, unsweeping provision to shield corporations for 5 years from liability for negligent treatment of workers and consumers, but there's no new sweeping provision to shield Americans from evictions or foreclosures. It includes a $30 billion wish list for defense contractors, but no funding to make sure Americans can vote safely in November. There are reports that the Republican proposal may include a provision to lower capital standards at Wall Street big banks, but nothing to help state, local, and tribal governments keep teachers and firefighters, bus drivers on the job. Senate Republicans managed to sneak in nearly $2 billion in taxpayer funds for a new FBI building whose location will increase the value of the Trump Hotel and enrich the president and his family. Yep. In this proposal, Senate Republicans reward the president and his family's business interests, but not our essential workers. Who, my Republican friends, needs the help more? President Trump, who proudly claims he's a billionaire, or a worker who's about to lose his job, a small business person whose business is going under, a family that can't feed hungry children? Who needs the help more, them or President Trump? And perhaps, worst of all, in the middle of a pandemic, Senate Republicans in the White House want to give out-of-work Americans a 30% pay cut. If you've lost your job through no fault of your own, and you can't go back to work because the administration bungled this crisis, Senate Republicans propose taking $1,600 out of your pocket every single month. Well, let me show my colleagues what New Yorkers think of the Republican proposal. Let them eat cake. GOP plan slices, $600 check, rejects aids to states. Let them eat cake. That's what New Yorkers think. That's what New Yorkers think. That's what Americans think. Let them eat cake. Shame. Shame on our Republican friends. The cover of the New York Daily News sums it up. Let them eat cake. Let them eat cake sums up the Republican proposal in response to the greatest economic crisis in 75 years. Let them eat cake. People can't feed their kids. People are losing their homes, getting kicked out of their apartments. Small businesses are going under. Republican response, let them eat cake. Who are the Republicans fighting for in this proposal? Tax breaks for 3 martini lunches, but no food assistance for the poor? Immunity for corporations, but no immunity for Americans facing eviction? 20, 30 million unemployed Americans, and Republicans say take a 30% tax cut, pay cut? Who are the Republicans fighting for in this proposal? If you're a big bank, a defense contractor, a member of the Trump family, the Republican proposal has some good news for you. But if you can barely afford the rent, can't find work, can't feed your kids, or are fighting your family's future, the Republican plan leaves you out in the cold. Consequences of the Republican policy on unemployment alone would be disastrous. Those enhanced benefits have kept 12 million Americans out of poverty. Those enhanced benefits are the one bright spot in this declining economy, that consumer spending is going up now, in large part because of pandemic unemployment insurance as well as PPP. One of the few things that's kept our economy from deteriorating further is that these unemployment benefits have boosted consumer spending. That's why economists say the Republican proposal would cost over 1 million jobs this year and 3.4 million jobs next year. The Republican proposal is costing us to lose even more jobs. States have warned us that the Republican plan on unemployment is unworkable to boot. We called state unemployment offices yesterday to ask them what would happen if the Republicans passed this new scheme. One state office simply said chaos, chaos. Office after office said it would take weeks, months to even implement the new plan. And what are people going to do during those weeks and months when they're not getting unemployment insurance? The idea on the Republican side that we have to slash unemployment benefits because otherwise Americans won't go back to work is exaggerated. Americans want to work, are ready to work, are desperate to get back to work. Such little faith in the American people. Such a bad outlook on human nature. People want to work, Republican friends. They just don't have jobs to do it. We're not going to let them starve while that happens. God forbid we provide tens of millions of unemployed Americans a lifeline until we defeat this disease and get our economy back on its feet. Seems to be the Republican attitude. That the Republicans seem to think the American people are a bunch of loafers. Well, they are not. Now, we Democrats want to get something done. We are certainly frustrated with the dithering, the disunity, and the lack of understanding of the depth of the crisis coming from the Republican side. But that will not stop us. We must press on with bipartisan negotiations. Time is running out. We cannot afford to fail. But the Republican new proposal is not an adequate starting point. And history is repeating itself. Each time we came together in the past to pass COVID-2, COVID-3, COVID-3-5, it was because both parties sat down with each other and negotiated and did the hard work. But that was only after Republicans dared us and put an inadequate proposal on the floor and said, we'll blame you. We held firm. They came back. We negotiated a much better bill. My hope, my belief, is that they will have to do that again. Leader McConnell is in his Alice in Wonderland characterizations here on the floor. I can't believe them. He keeps insisting on a bipartisan spirit led to the CARES Act, but he skips over the fact that he dropped a partisan bill on the floor, and Democrats had to insist on continuing negotiating to make the bill significantly better. There's a lot of revisionist history going on the other side of the aisle. And this morning, McConnell continued with his Alice in Wonderland logic, suggesting that Democrats are going to be the ones standing in the way of more relief. Let's not forget, Republicans dithered for 3 months while Democrats pleaded for action on COVID. Speaker Pelosi and I wrote to McConnell 3 weeks ago, to Leader McConnell, and said, let's sit down and talk. We didn't hear a peep at him. And when Republicans finally woke up to the calamity in our country, they bickered among themselves for a week as the country approached several cliffs: unemployment, eviction, state and local government, and more. And now that the Republicans finally have a proposal, it's corporate focused, doesn't meet the needs of the American people, and half of their own caucus probably won't support it anyway. Leader McConnell a few minutes ago said if Democrats don't want to negotiate a bill, I will remind the leader. Last night, Chief of Staff Meadows, Secretary Mnuchin, Speaker Pelosi, and I were in the Speaker's office negotiating. Why didn't Mnuchin and Meadows bring McConnell along? Because the Senate Republicans can't get their act together and produce a unified position. So, Leader McConnell, I have a suggestion. Instead of blaming Democrats, how about Senate Republicans and Leader McConnell get their act together, roll up their sleeves, and actually get to do real work and solve these problems? Every time we've come to pass critical relief, Democrats have forced our Republican colleagues in the White House to come to the table and negotiate in a serious way. That's what we have to do again. We need bipartisan, bicameral negotiations to produce a bill that meets the needs of the American people. We Democrats will continue to do that. Speaker Pelosi and I will be meeting with Mnuchin and Meadows again tonight in an effort to try and get a bill, because the needs of the American people, the American economy, American health is so great. Let us come together, get something done. America desperately needs our help. I yield the floor.
Madam Speaker.
Senator from Illinois.
Madam Speaker, I want to thank my colleague and the leader on the Democratic side, Senator Schumer, for his specific, articulate, and direct analysis of where we stand today in the United States Senate. Faced with the worst public health crisis in 100 years, faced with the worst economic crisis in 75 to 80 years, the message from the Republican side of the aisle is think small, do as little as possible. Let's see how this works out. At a time when we have unemployment figures breaking all records, when we have 10 times the unemployment claims in Illinois that we did a year ago, I might add 10 times the unemployment claims in the Commonwealth of Kentucky that they did a year ago. We instead are hearing from the Republican side of the aisle that the problem with our economy is not unemployment, It's the fact that the people who are unemployed are being given too much money. Right now, we have a federal benefit package worth $600 a week. It was enacted in the CARES Act on March 26th that expires in 3 days. $600 a week, federal supplement over the state payment. What the Republicans have suggested is to cut that $600 federal supplement to $200. And then they turn and say, well, what we really want to do is to compensate the worker with 70% of what they were earning when they were laid off. There's a real serious problem here that they're not disclosing to the American people. Back in March, when we proposed a similar approach, or one that took into consideration the previous wages of an unemployed worker, who told us to stop that consideration? President Trump's Secretary of Labor. Secretary Scalia came to us, and I was at the meeting when he said, you don't understand. You cannot make this kind of change in the states because there are 50 different computer systems in the employment security offices across each and every state in the union. They cannot make this adjustment. They cannot make this change. The only way, they told us, Secretary Scalia told us in March, is a flat dollar amount to each unemployed worker, which is exactly what we did. And now the Republicans come to us and ignore that advice, ignore that guidance that led to $600 a week, and say, we'll come up with an elaborate formula of 70% of what you were paid before. As Senator Schumer from New York said earlier, we surveyed a dozen states, and they all told us impossible to 5 or 6 months before we're ready to do something in that manner. And that means for millions of Americans currently unemployed, possibility of only receiving $200 a week until some day in the future when these state unemployment systems can possibly change. That's the Republican approach. And they've made a big point, as Senator McConnell did this morning on the floor, of a $1,200 check, a cash payment, such as we had back in March. I'm not opposed to that. The president's desperate for it because he gets to sign the checks. He wants his signature on the checks that are going out to these individuals. Well, Mr. President, if that's what you want, be my guest, if it's going to help working families. But make no mistake, a $1,200 check to a family that was receiving $600 a week, $2,400 a month, is cold comfort and won't help them pay the bills that they face every single month. I only wish that the Republicans are calling for these dramatic cuts in unemployment compensation for millions of Americans, 30 million Americans. I only wish they would go home to Kentucky and other states and sit down for a meal with an unemployed family and let them tell these Republicans what they are facing each and every month trying to get by, even with this unemployment check. You see, there's an assumption. There's an assumption these people have a lot of money in savings. It's not reality. In the real world, half of American families have little or no savings to turn to, even before this current economic downturn. Imagine what they're going through now and the sacrifices they have to make. Surely the Republican leaders have heard the stories or seen firsthand, as I have, families showing up at food banks and pantries looking for a helping hand to put something on the table to feed their families. Some of them with their eyes down to the ground, with tears in those eyes because they never dreamed they'd be in this position in life. And what is the alternative suggested from the Republican side? Cut the unemployment compensation for millions of Americans at this moment in history. Think small, the Republicans say. We can get through this by doing as little as possible. That is not true. We've been told over and over again that if we take our foot off the accelerator to try to move this economy out of the ditch, it'll crash even further. And we don't want that to happen. We want people to get back to work and businesses to reopen and schools to reopen. But we've got to do the right thing in terms of providing compensation to individuals. I reject the premise that many Republicans bring to this conversation, that if you're not rich, you must be lazy in America. I don't think unemployed people in this country are lazy people. I think they're hardworking people who have been dealt a tough hand of cards. They're trying to keep their families together until they can get back to work into a decent job. And cutting unemployment compensation at this moment in history is cruel, inhuman, and insensitive to the realities that these families are facing every single day. There is one provision that came out yesterday that I want to speak to for a moment. For months, literally for months, Senator McConnell has come to the floor and criticized Speaker Pelosi for her efforts to pass the HEROES Act almost 10 weeks ago. 10 weeks ago, the House of Representatives, under Speaker Pelosi, passed legislation to provide COVID-19 relief that we knew was coming because we knew the unemployment benefits were going to expire in just a few days. She saw that coming and 10 weeks ago did what was the right thing to do. She mustered her troops. They voted for, provided a majority to vote for a package that moves us forward, that helps state and local governments face the reality of this economy, helps hospitals, helps individuals pay for their health insurance. A good package and one that I can readily support. Senator McConnell came to the floor frequently, regularly, several times a week, saying how bad that package was, how terrible it was, while he did nothing, while the Republicans proposed no alternative. It's just like the Affordable Care Act. They've done everything they can 150 times to try to repeal it and never once proposed an alternative. The same thing is true when it comes to this COVID-19 relief. In this circumstance, we received finally yesterday this proposal that was brought by Senator Cornyn and on behalf of himself and Senator McConnell to address the issue of the immunity of corporations for lawsuits that have any relation to COVID-19. Immunity for these corporations so that they won't be held liable if in fact they're not performing up to the standards necessary to protect employees and customers. 65 pages long. It's a big giveaway to the biggest corporations in America. The Republican corporate immunity bill does nothing to protect workers, improve safety standards, or give business incentives to take proper precautions to reduce the spread of coronavirus. In fact, this bill does just the opposite. It views workers and victims as the problem, and it sets high hurdles that prevent meritorious COVID-related claims from having a day in court. What the bill would do is impose sweeping federal preemption on the rights of workers and victims to bring cases in state courts for COVID-related harm. It would supplant state laws that require businesses to act with reasonable care. Then it would say that businesses are shielded from liability in federal court if they merely make an effort to comply with the weakest available mandatory safety standard that applies to them, so long as they're not grossly negligent. So what are the kinds of safety standards that the bill would urge businesses to follow? Well, it certainly wouldn't be the guidelines of the Centers for Disease Control because those aren't mandatory. So amazingly, a business can get shielded from liability under this Republican approach, even if they make no effort to comply with the Center for Disease Control guidelines. How does that make us any safer? Not only that, but if workers or sick Americans want to try to bring a meritorious COVID-related case under this bill puts them through a gauntlet of tort reform obstacles that makes it nearly impossible to prevail. A heightened burden of proof, heightened pleading requirements, limits on discovery, damage caps, restrictions on joint and several liability, and so much more. The Republican bill also creates sweeping federal preemption of medical malpractice cases, including claims under medical malpractice not even related to COVID-19. It would upend the medical liability laws of all 50 states for 5 years. Instead of setting a strong, clear, enforceable federal safety standard like OSHA Emergency Temporary Standard, the Republican bill would actually shield businesses from regulatory enforcement proceedings under OSHA, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and more. The liability immunity under this bill would last for 5 years, from December 2019 through 2024. The fact that Republicans are proposing 5 years of liability immunity for corporations while promising just a few months of assistance for workers tells the whole story about priorities and values. Let's be clear. Republicans have not made the case for why we would even consider federal liability immunity for corporations. Remember, under current state tort law, if a business has taken reasonable precautions, they won't be held liable for negligence. State laws give business incentive to act reasonably, and most businesses do. Also, time and again, I've heard Senator McConnell and Senator Cornyn come to the floor and talk about the tsunami of lawsuits. This morning, Senator McConnell said, an epidemic of frivolous lawsuits. Well, it just so happens that we keep track of lawsuits filed in the United States of America, and we can look to the pleadings in those lawsuits to see how many times they mention coronavirus or COVID-19. So we know how many lawsuits have been filed since the first of the year related to this pandemic. We know that despite the fact that 4 million, at least 4 million, COVID infections have been established in the United States, 4 million. You know how many medical malpractice cases have been filed by any of those 4 million Americans or anyone else against doctors, hospitals, nurses, providers? What is the epidemic number? Well, we have it. Here's the exact number of medical malpractice cases filed in the United States in the last 6 months. 6. An epidemic? A tsunami? Okay, how about personal injury lawsuits, Senator? How many have been filed listing COVID-19 or coronavirus as one of the reasons for these lawsuits? 15. 4 million infected Americans, 15 lawsuits, and the Republicans have come to us and want to turn upside down the immunity and liability questions for the states and the nation. How about unsafe workplace lawsuits? Now that's got to be a big category. 4 million infected Americans. How many workers have brought lawsuits? 71. In the entire 50 states of America, 71 lawsuits. There is no flood of worker or victim lawsuits. It's a figment of the imagination of Senator McConnell, Senator Cornyn, and K Street. But we certainly shouldn't, at this moment in time, ignore the obvious. Over 20 states have stepped forward and established their own standards for lawsuits when it comes to the pandemic that faces us. This effort by the Republicans would preempt that state action. There have been hundreds and hundreds of COVID lawsuits that have been filed, business to business, on questions like insurance liability. You don't hear the Republicans wanting to stop businesses from filing lawsuits. No, just workers and the people who get sick. There's no need for the federal government to step in and override 50 states' liability laws, especially after the federal government has been deferring to states on every other aspect of this pandemic. Testing, PPE, masks, stay-at-home orders. Time and again, this president says, leave it to the governors, leave it to the mayors, except when it comes to protecting big corporations. If states need to adjust their liability laws, they can do so. 28 states have already done it. So here's the bottom line. The Republican immunity bill would upend state laws, give businesses incentives to cut corners, jeopardize the safety of workers and families, and risk further spread of this virus. It is a big business giveaway. That is not what America needs. Madam President, this is not a small challenge. It is an historic challenge. We shouldn't take the Republican lead and play small ball. We ought to address this head on. First, we need leadership at the top, which we have not had from the president. He has deferred time and again to governors and mayors and other officials at the local level, telling them, find your own masks, establish your own testing regimes, find your own way out of this crisis. When we needed federal leadership from the president, we did not receive it. America knows that. Why is it that this nation, with 5% of the world population, has 25% of the COVID infection cases in the world? Why? What happened here? Why didn't we follow the lead of other countries that stepped up with presidential leadership? Countries that have found dramatically less infection, dramatically fewer deaths. That's the reality of where we are today at this pandemic. The reality of our economy, we stepped in on March 26th, passed the CARES Act. We've managed to keep some businesses going. We've managed to keep millions of unemployed Americans together with their families through the most difficult period of their lives. And now, at this moment, the Republican leadership says, think small. This is all going to pass quickly. Don't worry about these families that don't have enough to provide food and shelter and the basics for their family. They'll get by with a lot less, from $600 a week to $200 a week. They'll do just fine, according to the Republicans. I disagree. Our first obligation should be to these working families, going through the toughest period they can ever imagine. Stick with them, stand with them. Be prepared to put the money on the table, which we know they'll spend right back into the economy. We'll see more unemployment if we follow the Republican approach. It's estimated some 3 million jobs will be killed by the Republican approach of cutting unemployment and the consequent downturn in spending by these same families. Let's stick with those families now. They need us. Madam President, I yield the floor. Suggest the evidence of call.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
Can you live off of that? I most certainly can't. You know what I mean? When I was in Miami in the United States, I was living with my mama. So I know it's a tough situation. $200 when you have to pay car insurance, you got to go to the grocery. Like $200 for groceries is good, but then what about the car insurance? You got to pay light bill. Light bill can be around $100 to another $1,500, right? Not $1,500, another $200. Your car insurance, your health insurance, that would be $800. It would be really tough to get by. But let me know if that's doable. Does that make sense? But anyways, guys, I want to say thank you. I will be here tomorrow to find out what they're talking about. I love these live streams because we get to see them at their work, and you get to see what their opinions are and what the opposition is between the both. I think the biggest news I've heard from this whole bill we didn't get yesterday was the fact that the Senate bill would provide provisions to create a new FBI building that would be located right next to Donald Trump's one of Donald Trump's property, that would boost that property's value, which is insane. Guys. And this is one of the reasons why we need to watch these live streams, continue to watch these live streams. That way we can see what they're up to, what type of extra stuff they're putting in a bill, whether it be good, bad, or what by any means. Anyways, guys, see you guys tomorrow, right? Really appreciate it. I want to give a couple shout outs. Official ending. Guys, see you guys tomorrow. Don't miss out. Make sure you subscribe. Is it the take it or leave it approach? We can't wait to see and find out what happens next. So make sure you subscribe, and I'll see you guys tomorrow morning, all right, for some new live stream. If you're watching this video after the live stream, that's cool because I will still continue to post it, all right? Thank you. See you guys tomorrow. All right. So any of you guys got any questions?